The dust of Fort Cinder was a fine, forgotten powder that coated everything in a uniform shade of neglect. It settled on the rusted tin roofs of the stables, clung to the splintered rails of the corral, and filmed the stagnant water in the troughs. Here, at the military's designated boneyard for obsolete assets, the silence was broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through cracked window panes and the occasional, restless stamp of a hoof. This was a place where things, and sometimes people, came to be forgotten. It was into this purgatory that Command Sergeant Major Elias Thorne arrived, a man as weathered and out of place as the history he represented. His back was ramrod straight, a testament to a discipline the modern army had little use for, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. He carried a single duffel bag and a lifetime of knowledge that the Pentagon had deemed irrelevant. His welcome was a sneer wrapped in military courtesy, delivered by Major Rourke, a man whose crisp, new multicam uniform seemed an affront to the decay surrounding them. Rourke's face was a mask of condescending ambition, his posture a swagger of self-importance earned in simulators and air-conditioned command tents. He held a tablet, his fingers swiping through digital manifests, the very picture of 21st century warfare. "Thorne, is it?" Rourke said, not looking up. "Heard you were coming. The old guard. Command felt you needed a place to ride out your last few years. Welcome to the Legacy Ordnance and Livestock Division. It's a mouthful, I know. We just call it the scrap heap." He finally looked at Thorne, his eyes flicking over the older man's worn service uniform, lingering for a moment on the faded jump wings and the quiet constellation of ribbons that spoke of conflicts Rourke had only read about. "Your charge is over there." He gestured vaguely with the tablet toward the dilapidated stables. "The hayburners. Try to keep them from costing us too much." Thorne said nothing. He simply offered a slow, deliberate nod. His silence seemed to irritate the Major, who thrived on reaction. "Look, Sergeant Major," Rourke continued, his tone dripping with false patience. "Let's be clear. Those things are relics. They serve their purpose in some black and white movie, but we run on horsepower, not horse sense. My guys are training for the real world, with real assets. Humvees, MRAPs, drones. You and your petting zoo stay out of our way. The last thing I need is one of my convoys getting held up by a runaway pony. Understood?" Thorne's gaze shifted past Rourke, toward the corral. There, a dozen mustangs stood, their coats matted with mud and burrs, their heads low. They were magnificent animals, descendants of the very stock that had carried soldiers across continents, now reduced to ghosts in a forgotten corner of the army. He saw the intelligence in their deep, dark eyes, the coiled power in their neglected muscles. They were not relics, they were dormant legends. He turned his gaze back to Rourke, his expression unreadable. "Crystal clear, Major." The next few weeks fell into a rhythm of quiet defiance. While Rourke's mechanized platoons tore up the training grounds, churning dust and belching diesel fumes, Thorne began the painstaking work of reclamation. He started not with saddles and bridles, but with a curry comb and a soft voice. He spent hours simply being with the horses, allowing them to reacquaint themselves with a gentle hand. He cleaned the stalls himself, humming old cavalry tunes his grandfather had taught him. He measured their feed with a precision that bordered on reverence, mixing in supplements he paid for out of his own pocket. The younger soldiers, Rourke's men, watched from a distance, smirking. They saw an old man playing with farm animals, a living fossil polishing other fossils. They'd call out from their trucks, "Hey, Sergeant Major, don't forget to check their tire pressure." Or, "Need a jump, Thorne? I got cables." He never responded, never gave them the satisfaction of a reaction. His focus was singular, his purpose absolute. He was tending to forgotten soldiers, and he would afford them the dignity they were due. He found his lead in a powerful gray gelding with a scar above its left eye and a spirit that hadn't been entirely broken by neglect. Thorne named him Ghost, for the way he moved with a silent, fluid grace even in the confines of the muddy paddock. He saw the flicker of a leader in the horse's intelligent gaze, the instinct to watch over the small, beleaguered herd. Slowly, patiently, Thorne worked with Ghost, reintroducing him to the bit and saddle, not with force, but with a partnership built on mutual respect. He'd speak to the horse in low tones, his words a murmur of encouragement and shared history. "They don't see you, boy," he'd whisper, running a hand down the horse's powerful neck. "They look right through you. They see something old. But we know better, don't we? We know what endurance looks like." The other mustangs watched, and as they saw Ghost yield to the old man's touch, a current of trust began to flow through the herd. They were remembering who they were. Thorn was not just grooming horses, he was awakening an army. The terrain surrounding Fort Cinder was known as the Devil's Anvil, a brutal expanse of jagged rock, steep canyons, and treacherous shale slides that chewed up vehicle transmissions and humbled the most experienced drivers. It was here that Rourke sought to prove the supremacy of his machines. And it was here that they consistently failed. A supply truck would slide into a ravine, its rescue a day-long affair involving heavy winches and snapped cables. A scout Humvee would get high-centered on a rock shelf, its occupants stranded for hours. Rourke would always blame the equipment or the driver, never the fundamental flaw in his thinking, that power could conquer terrain that demanded agility. After one such incident, where a Humvee was mired to its axles in a seemingly solid patch of ground that was, in fact, a hidden mud bog, Rourke's recovery team was failing. Cables snapped under the strain. Thorn appeared on the ridge line, mounted on Ghost, leading a sturdy-looking roan with a length of rope coiled at the saddle horn. Rourke saw him and groaned, the sight an unwelcome intrusion on his technological frustrations. "What do you want, Thorn? Come to offer a sugar cube?" His men snickered. Thorn ignored him. He dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He walked the perimeter of the bog, testing the ground with his boot. He spoke quietly to the panicked driver, then returned to his horse. With a series of knots that seemed to flow from his fingers like a weaver at a loom, he fashioned a harness, distributing the potential load across the frame of the crippled vehicle. He attached his lariat not to the saddle horn, a rookie mistake that could injure the horse, but to the thick leather of the saddle's swell, wrapped in a way that used the horse's entire body as a pulling machine. He mounted Ghost, backed him until the rope was taut, and gave a soft cluck of his tongue. The horse leaned into the weight, muscles bunching in its powerful haunches. There was no spinning of wheels, no roar of an engine. There was only the steady, relentless application of living power. The Humvee groaned, metal protesting, and then, with a great sucking sound, it slid free from the mud's grasp. Rourke and his men stood in stunned silence. The Major found his voice first, a forced, dismissive chuckle. "Huh! Guess the old mules have a use after all." Lucky pull, Thorn simply coiled his rope, gave the Major a slow nod, and rode away, the clatter of hooves on rock a quiet rebuke to the silent, idling engines. The announcement of Operation Anvil Strike sent a current of excitement through the base. It was to be a full-scale readiness exercise, simulating a divisional push through hostile territory. And the distinguished visitor observing the operation would be none other than Lieutenant General McLaren, a commander known for his no-nonsense attitude and his deep respect for military history. For Major Rourke, this was his moment, the performance that would surely earn him his next promotion. He spent days briefing his platoons, poring over satellite imagery, and boasting in the mess hall about the overwhelming force projection his mechanized company would demonstrate. He made a point of cornering Thorn by the stables. "Just so we're on the same page, Sergeant Major," he said, his voice loud enough for his nearby subordinates to hear. "This is a modern warfare simulation. I need the training area clear of distractions. Keep your livestock penned up. I don't want General McLaren thinking this is a damned rodeo." Thorn was polishing a piece of tack, his hands moving with practiced care. He didn't look up. "The Mustangs will not be a distraction, Major." The quiet certainty in his voice was more infuriating to Rourke than any argument. It was the confidence of a man who knew a truth the Major was blind to. The morning of the exercise dawned cold and clear. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue. General McLaren arrived by helicopter, his presence lending a palpable weight to the proceedings. He was an imposing man with a gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. He shook Rourke's hand, offered a few encouraging words, and then took his place in the mobile command center perched on a high ridge overlooking the Devil's Anvil. From there, he had a panoramic view of the entire operational area, fed by drone streams and radio chatter. The exercise began with a roar. Rourke's convoy of Humvees and light armored vehicles plunged into the anvil, a spear of steel and ambition. For the first hour, everything went according to Rourke's meticulously planned script. Then, without warning, the world went silent. A single, piercing tone echoed from the command center's speakers, the simulated signal for a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse, an EMP. On the general's main screen, the drone feeds blinked out one by one. The radio, which had been a cacophony of status reports, hissed into static. Every vehicle in the convoy, with its complex web of modern electronics, died instantly. Rourke's spearhead was no longer a weapon. It was a collection of metal coffins scattered across the most inhospitable terrain on the base. The 21st century army was blind, deaf, and paralyzed. From a parallel ridge a mile away, Elias Thorne watched the exercise through a pair of old, reliable binoculars. He had not been surprised by the EMP simulation. It was a standard, if brutal, test of a unit's fundamental resilience. He had seen the lead vehicle shudder to a halt, had watched the confused figures of soldiers emerge from their silent machines. He saw the isolation, the breakdown of command and control, the sudden, terrifying vulnerability. Down in the command center, General McLaren stared at the dead screens, his jaw tight. He turned to an aide. "Get me Major Rourke. Get me anyone." The aide worked the radio frantically, cycling through frequencies, his voice growing more strained with each failed attempt. "Nothing, sir." Complete blackout. On the battlefield, Rourke was experiencing the same technological death. His satellite phone was useless. His vehicle's comms were fried. He was a commander with no army, surrounded by his men who were looking to him for answers he didn't have. Panic, the insidious enemy of every leader, began to creep into the edges of his mind. It was then that a new figure appeared on the landscape. General McLaren raised his own binoculars, focusing on the movement. It was a lone rider, silhouetted against the sky, moving with an unhurried, almost regal pace down a scree slope that would have been suicide for a man on foot, let alone a vehicle. Thorne, mounted on Ghost, descended toward the paralyzed convoy. He led a string of 4 other Mustangs, each outfitted with custom-made pack saddles, their loads balanced with an expert's touch. When he reached Rourke, the major was a portrait of impotent fury. "Thorne! What in the blazes are you doing here? I gave you a direct order to stay clear!" he bellowed, his voice tight with desperation. Thorne swung down from the saddle, his boots landing softly in the dust. He looked past Rourke, at the faces of the young soldiers, seeing their uncertainty and fear. "Major," Thorne said, his voice calm and even, a rock in a sea of chaos. "Your men are cut off. You've got simulated casualties in the 3rd vehicle who need immediate evac, and your water supplies are in the rear of the convoy, a mile back over impassable terrain. General McLaren is blind and you're all sitting ducks. With your permission, I'm going to re-establish a line of communication, resupply your squads, and get your casualties to the rally point." Rourke stared, speechless. The old man he had mocked, the relic he had dismissed, was now standing before him, offering the only lifeline available. "What are you going to do?" Rourke sputtered, a last gasp of arrogance. "Send a smoke signal?" Thorne met his gaze. "No, Major. I'm going to do the job." And with that, the demonstration began. General McLaren, his attention utterly captivated, never lowered his binoculars. He watched as Thorne, with a few quiet words and hand signals, dispatched 2 of his pack horses with 2 young soldiers, men who had previously mocked him but now looked at him with wide-eyed reverence. The horses, laden with water and medical supplies, moved out, not along the destroyed track the vehicles had attempted, but up and over the ridge, using game trails and ancient paths invisible to the untrained eye. They moved with a sureness of foot that was breathtaking. McLaren watched, mesmerized, As one of the Mustangs navigated a narrow ledge, shale crumbling under its hooves, its balance perfect, its movements economical, a feat of agility that made the billion-dollar machines sitting useless below look like clumsy, primitive toys. This was not just transportation. This was a symphony of instinct, training, and terrain. Thorne himself, on Ghost, became the nerve center of the shattered operation. He galloped from platoon to platoon, his horse's hooves striking sparks from the rock. He carried messages scribbled on a notepad, relaying orders and gathering intelligence. He became the commander's eyes and ears. McLaren watched a slow-motion drama unfold through his lenses, Thorne arriving at the vehicle with the simulated casualties. He saw him and another soldier fashion a travois, a stretcher dragged between two long poles, an ancient and effective technique. He watched them lash it to one of the strongest Mustangs. The horse, placid and steady, accepted the burden without complaint and began the slow, careful journey back toward the designated casualty collection point, navigating the treacherous ground with a delicacy no machine could ever replicate. It was a masterclass in a forgotten art. Thorne wasn't just using horses, he was thinking like a cavalryman, seeing the landscape not as an obstacle to be smashed through, but as a medium to be flowed with. He used the high ground for observation, the ravines for concealed movement, the horse's stamina for relentless, engine-less mobility. He was a living conduit to a warrior wisdom that the Army, in its rush for technological supremacy, had almost completely discarded. The general felt a profound sense of awe, mixed with an equally profound sense of institutional shame. They hadn't just neglected some old horses. They had forgotten how to be soldiers when the lights went out. As the exercise's designated time for the EMP effect concluded, the world came back to life with a jolt. The radios crackled, screens flickered on, and engines, one by one, coughed back into service. But the damage to pride and perception was already done. The first vehicle to reach the command post was not Major Rourke's command Humvee, but a dusty, sweat-streaked Thorne astride Ghost, who stood calmly, his head high, as if he knew he had just rewritten his own legacy. Minutes later, General McLaren's jeep pulled up. He didn't send an aide, he walked over to Thorne himself. The general, a man whose presence usually made colonels stammer, stood before the sergeant major with an expression of unadorned respect. "Thorne," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "I've been in this army for 35 years. I've seen smart bombs and stealth fighters. I've commanded digital divisions. And I have to tell you, what I saw today was one of the finest displays of soldiership I have ever witnessed." Major Rourke arrived then, his face a storm of humiliation and disbelief. He stood stiffly at attention, avoiding everyone's eyes. The general turned his gaze on him, and the warmth vanished, replaced by glacial disappointment. "Major," McLaren said, his voice cutting through the air, "you had the most advanced light infantry company in the sector. You had every technological advantage. And you were decisively defeated by a simulated power outage and outmaneuvered by a man with 5 horses. You saw relics, he saw assets. You saw an obstacle, he saw an opportunity. You were so busy looking at your screens that you forgot to look at the ground beneath your feet. Your command performance today was not just a failure, it was an embarrassment." He didn't raise his voice, which somehow made the words more devastating. He turned back to Thorne. "Sergeant Major, you were given a scrapyard and you turned it into a strategic resource. You and your soldiers reminded us of a fundamental truth: technology is a tool, not a substitute for skill, ingenuity, and courage." In the weeks that followed, a seismic shift occurred at Fort Cinder. Major Rourke was quietly reassigned to a desk job in a sub-basement of the Pentagon, his meteoric career trajectory permanently altered. The Legacy Ordnance and Livestock Division was officially deactivated, and in its place, the United States Army Cavalry Reconnaissance and Logistics Program was born, with Command Sergeant Major Elias Thorne as its head instructor. The rusted stables were torn down and replaced with a state-of-the-art facility. The herd of Mustangs, once ghosts destined for the rendering plant, were now the proud founding stock of a new generation of 4-legged soldiers. Young, eager troopers, the same ones who had once mocked the old man, now vied for a spot in his program, listening with rapt attention as he taught them how to tie a diamond hitch, how to read terrain, and how to speak the silent language of a trusted mount. Thorn never gloated, never once said, "I told you so." He simply continued his work, his quiet dignity his only commentary. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the bustling new training ground, General McLaren stood with Thorn, watching the mustangs graze peacefully. "You know, Elias," the general said, using his first name for the first time, "we almost forgot. We almost traded something priceless for something that just looked shiny." Thorn watched Ghost, who nickered softly and nudged his shoulder. He patted the great horse's neck, a sense of profound peace settling over him. He hadn't sought vindication, only purpose. And in breathing life back into these forgotten heroes, he had rediscovered his own, proving that the most enduring strength is not forged in steel, but is born of flesh, bone, and an unbreakable spirit.